So today we are going to close our discussion about the Arab-Israeli conflict for the IB exam with the peace process, the beginning of the Arab-Israeli peace process and culminating in the Camp David Accords. All right, these are the last things that the IB could center a paper one on for you. We're going to talk a little bit about where the Israelis and the Americans and the Egyptians are in the mid to late 1970s and how they ultimately all come together to work out some kind of agreement between two nations that have now been to war in 1948, conflict in the Suez in 1956, 1967 June War, the Six-Day War, the War of Attrition over the Suez Canal in the interwar years between 67 and the 1973 October War. So these two countries had been to war countless times, had constantly been in a state of war, a state of belligerency, with Egypt refusing to recognize Israel's existence. And in the late 1970s, they come together. First, let's talk about Israel. This man, his name is Menachem Begin. Menachem Begin, M-E-N-A-C-H-E-M. I'm going to have a glass of water here, a bottle of water. What could possibly go wrong?
Put it right near the bowl.
Menachem Begin is going to be the leader of Israel, the prime minister of Israel in the mid-1970s. Menachem Begin, B-E-G-I-N, is how you spell his last name. He is the leader of the Likud party in Israel. Likud is L-I-K-U-D. Likud. The Likud party of Israel is the right wing of Israeli politics. All right? These are the successors to the what we call the revisionists. Those Israeli politicians who were right-wingers and who felt that all of Palestine, including the West Bank and Gaza, should be a part of Israel. So they were revisionists, they evolve into becoming the Likud party, and Menachem Begin becomes the Likud prime minister in the late 70s. Yes?
The revisionists wanted to keep all the land, right?
Yeah, they wanted more land for the state of Israel, even including the West Bank and Gaza. Yeah. Kind of crazy. You wouldn't think. Yeah, exactly. He's one of the... So the point of mentioning this, and this is what Samir is noticing already, is why would a guy from this right wing of Israeli politics be the guy that's ultimately working out a deal? That's your sister's name. You are Sarika. I'm sorry about that. Why would he be the guy that's working out a deal? Kind of crazy how politics works. So it seems unlikely that a guy like Menachem Begin and the Likud party, now in control of Israel, would offer up the West Bank or Gaza Strip in any kind of negotiation. He's also publicly supporting the construction of new settlements in the West Bank and in Gaza. Now, we've already talked about the settlement construction being one of the major issues between the Arabs and the Israelis. The Israelis have occupied these 4 occupied territories: Sinai, Gaza, West Bank, Golan Heights, since 1967. They've been building settlements in them, communities in them, within these Palestinian-occupied territories. And this is deeply concerning for Palestinians that hope that that land will one day be a state of theirs, because now you've got these Jewish communities sprouting up. So this guy seems like one of the last ones that would ever support any kind of peaceful resolution. In the United States, we have a new president in 1977. Mr. Harrison, you're excited about this guy?
Jimmy Carter.
Yeah. All right. So Jimmy Carter will replace and defeat in the 1976 election and ultimately replace Gerald Ford as president of the United States. Carter makes as one of his campaign pledges. You guys hear right now about politicians make a lot of promises for what they want to do when they're going to be president, like building big walls and having other people pay for them. Most of these campaign promises never come to fruition. They never actually happen. But they might get people to support you in an election. Well, Jimmy Carter is an advocate for what he calls a comprehensive settlement in the Middle East. Now, when we talk about comprehensive programs to solve problems, we mean like in one fell swoop, solving all the problems with one plan. That's the comprehensive settlement that Jimmy Carter would like to see. A single, one-time settlement that would resolve the disputes over the territories and ultimately, in Jimmy Carter's mind, create a state for Palestinians. He is an advocate of what is known as the two-state solution. Now, did Jimmy Carter invent the idea of the two-state solution? Nope. In fact, how far does it go back? Yeah, the United Nations, the British were talking about it back in the 30s, but then the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, UNSCOP, in 47 had a two-state plan. But obviously that never came to be. This is what Jimmy Carter is advocating. He recognizes, though, very early in his administration, upon visiting Syria and speaking with the leader of Syria, that he's not going to have widespread Arab support for a two-state solution. Syria has hopes that the Palestinian territories will fall under either Syrian control or PLO control affiliated with Syria. So Jimmy Carter's going to learn very early on that he's not going to be able to get all of the Arab nations in together to work on some kind of solution. So he's going to be more focused in his dealings and spend his attention on Egypt, who is more willing to work with some towards a peaceful resolution. At the same time that Carter is making overtures in the Middle East, Menachem Begin, the leader of Israel, Menachem Begin lets the Americans know, secretly at first, that there might be a possibility for peace negotiations with Israel, that Israel is willing to talk. Now, this is a huge change in tone for the Israelis. If we remember Israel after 1967, they weren't willing to talk to the Egyptians or anybody else because they had won, they're stronger than their Arab neighbors, they've been made even stronger by American military aid going into Israel. There was no reason for the Israelis to talk. And then the 73 war came. And the 73 war, even though Israel could claim it was a victory, the 73 war was hugely costly for Israel in terms of men and material. And we now have a bigger movement within the Israeli populace that supports the idea of a peaceful resolution to this conflict, to end the current state of constant warfare. So Menachem Begin, even though he's like a right-winger Likud guy, is willing to open up peace negotiations. And then we go to the third player in this. And this is the Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat. Anwar Sadat, we recall, he's the guy that started that 1973 war. But if you remember, he started the 1973 war not because he wanted to overrun Israel, but because he needed the Israelis to recognize that this constant state of war was good for nobody, and he wanted to get the Americans and the Soviets to force Israel to talk. Sadat, S-A-D-A-T. So the 73 war was this limited war launched by Sadat to force Israel into some kind of negotiations. And in that sense, he absolutely won. In November of 1977, Sadat announces that he is willing to be the first Arab leader to travel to Israel and to speak before the Israeli parliament. The Israeli parliamentary body is called the Knesset, K-N-E-S-S-E-T. So Sadat is going to be an Arab leader. He's the leader of Egypt. He wants to go to Israel and he wants to speak before the Knesset. Immediately, Sadat is going to be denounced by other Arab states like Syria and the PLO itself for being a traitor to the Palestinian cause. This is only 10 years, remember, after all of the Arab League got together in Khartoum, Sudan, and said no peace, no recognition, and no negotiation with Israel. Well, if Sadat, the leader of Egypt, is going to go to Israel and speak before the Knesset, what is he doing right there? He's kind of starting negotiations. He's kind of starting, if you are a leader that goes to speak at another nation's representative body, you're kind of recognizing the legitimacy of that government, aren't you? Yeah. So Egypt is beginning to go another way. Now, why is Egypt willing to turn its back on the rest of the Arab world and the Palestinians? Has that worked out very well for Egypt? Has a constant state of warfare with Israel worked out very well for Egypt? Their economy is in shambles. The Suez Canal has been closed from 1967 to 1975, and that can't be closed again. And maybe reaching out and extending an olive branch to Israel gets more aid and support from the United States. And at this point, Sadat is looking for that. He's willing to take that to help improve the Egyptian economy. Now, the Americans were a little suspicious of this move. Whoa, Sadat. Don't just go to Israel and talk to them without us. Let us in there. We wanted to be in the middle of any negotiations that were happening to make sure that negotiations moved along in a way that was favorable towards the United States. But regardless of American intentions, Israel will accept Sadat's offer, and in November of 77, November 19th, 1977, Anwar Sadat will travel to Israel and speak before the Israeli Knesset, the first Arab leader to do so. November of 77. I remember this well. I was like 6 months old. It was a big time. The talks don't create any meaningful breakthroughs, but they talked. And I want to remind you of the last time I said that line, right? In 1955, when Dwight Eisenhower and Nikita Khrushchev met in Geneva, Switzerland, the first time the American and Soviet leader would meet since the end of World War II at the Potsdam Conference. And they spoke, and they didn't have any meaningful agreements, but they spoke. There was a spirit of Geneva. This ushers in the thaw of the Cold War, remember? So just getting the sides together to talk is a huge step, especially when the former line was, we won't talk to you, from both sides. So still they talked. But despite the overtures between Egypt and Israel, and now we must absolutely recognize, guys, that Egypt is not controlling the Arab world. All right? Egypt is on an island on its own now. You guys remember back in the 60s how Nasser wanted to control the Palestinians? He created the PLO so he could kind of keep the Palestinians under his thumb. Well, he doesn't have that control anymore. Sadat doesn't have that kind of control. And the rest of the Arab world is kind of turning away from Egypt. So even while Israel and Egypt are talking now, are having some conversations, violence from Palestinians against Israel is still existent. In March of 78, 35 Israelis will be killed in a bus attack by Palestinians who are supported from southern Lebanon. Yes, sir. March of 78. You don't have to worry too much about the year, just it's same time period. If you recall, yes, ma'am. Yes, I'm going to. So it was a Palestinian terrorist attack against Israelis. The bus attack, bombing on a bus. Killed 35. If you recall, and let's go back to our map. Let's find a good map here. There's a good one. Let's go back to our map. This does not seem to be working right now. Lost my control here. If you recall, in 1972, the nation of Jordan turned its attention to the PLO based in Jordan when the king of Jordan was targeted for assassination by Palestinians. And this ushered in a time period that the Palestinians referred to as Black September. You guys recall this? And the Palestinians were ultimately defeated. The PLO was defeated and driven out of Jordan. And they eventually take up refuge in Lebanon. All right? So the PLO is now working out of Lebanon. Now there's attacks going into Israel from the north, from Lebanon. And so Israel responds and will launch operations into Lebanon. As a side note to this story, the chaos in southern Lebanon after the Israeli invasion plants the seeds for the growth of a new organization called Hezbollah. If you guys have heard of Hezbollah, they're in southern Lebanon. It's a Shiite organization that moves to end the state of Israel. All right, that's the beginning of the Hezbollah story here. So anyway, just because Egypt and Israel are making some overtures to talk with each other does not mean we've got an end to the crisis in the Arab-Israeli conflict. So now we have President Jimmy Carter, who will orchestrate a meeting between the two leaders of Egypt and Israel. In September of 1978, Menachem Begin, seen here, Jimmy Carter, and Anwar Sadat will all meet at Camp David. Now, Camp David is the American president's retreat outside of Washington, D.C. And they will meet in Camp David to work on a possible negotiation for a peace between their nations. Sadat and Begin don't care much for each other. Begin is deeply distrustful of Sadat and his intentions. Do you guys remember? Sadat is the guy that launched the 1973 war. And now this is only 5 years later. So there's no rapport between Sadat and Begin. In fact, the two won't have any face-to-face meetings during this whole Camp David meeting period. You've got, remember we talked last week about shuttle diplomacy, Kissinger going from, during Nixon's administration, Kissinger going from Cairo to Israel, back to Cairo to Israel and trying to work out some kind of deal there. Jimmy Carter is kind of playing a mini shuttle diplomacy at Camp David. He goes to Sadat's cabin, talks to him, what are you willing to do? He goes to Begin's cabin, talks to him, what are you willing to do? He goes back and forth and back and forth. In the end, they come to an agreement. And what are known as the Camp David Accords will be reached on September 17th, 1978. And there's a few points that you should know about the Camp David Accords. First, that Israel, Egypt, Jordan included, because King Hussein and the United States are tight, Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and the Palestinian people will work to resolve their issues within 5 years. Now, I got some chuckles as I said that, because you guys are all very wise and you recognize what that means, right? To say that they will work out their issues within 5 years essentially does what for the meetings at Camp David? It kicks the can down the road, right? Hey, we're going to deal with that Palestinian issue. Not now, because it's tough, but we'll get to it eventually. Within 5 years, how about that? And then all you got to do is wait 4 years and 364 days, and then you can kick the can further down the road, right? But Sadat didn't want to go, he couldn't go back home with any kind of agreement that didn't address the Palestinian issue. Even if this barely addresses the Palestinian issue, at least it makes mention, it gives what we would call lip service to the Palestinian issue, right? It acknowledges that there's a Palestinian issue, and that's got to be dealt with at some point. But now that we've moved that out of the way, we can get to the bigger issues. Yes, sir?
It's Israel, Jordan, Egypt.
And then the Palestinian people, but who aren't really represented, because Israel does not talk to the PLO. And they're certainly not here. All right. Here's the bread and the butter of the Camp David Accords. Israel agrees to back out of the Sinai Peninsula. The Sinai Peninsula will go back to Egypt. So Israel will withdraw from the Sinai. For that move, Israel will receive free passage. Now, I don't mean free as in they don't have to pay anything, but they won't be barred from entering. Free passage through the Suez Canal and the Gulf of Suez. Israel had not been able to send its shipping through the Suez Canal for its entire existence. Do we remember when Israel was born? They were at war with Egypt, right? So the Suez Canal has been closed for business for Israeli shipping. According to the Camp David Accords, that's over. So Israel backs out of the Sinai. Israel gets access to the Suez Canal, which is fitting, right? Because do we remember what one of the main causes of that 6-day war when Israel first took the Sinai Peninsula was? They closed the Straits of Tiran. They threatened Israel's ability to trade with the Eastern Hemisphere. All right? So now the Suez Canal will be open. Now, let's read between the lines as well and acknowledge what else the Camp David Accords does. We talked about pushing the Palestinian issue 5 years into the future. Egypt gets back the Sinai. Israel is going to get access to the Suez Canal. But then what's it also do? It's a recognition of Israel's existence by Egypt. You can't work out a treaty with another nation if you don't recognize that nation's sovereignty, if you don't recognize that nation's ability to sign treaties. So, for the first time, the nation of Egypt has recognized Israel's right to exist.
Does this mean that Jordan does the same?
Jordan already does. Jordan's cool with Israel. This will be ratified in March of 1979. Here we have the official photo of Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin with a happy Jimmy Carter still between them, signing the Camp David Accords in March of 1979. Despite the Camp David Accords, it will bring a peaceful resolution to the Egyptian-Israeli story, but Israel still occupies the West Bank and Gaza, and they will not freeze settlement construction. There will still be new settlements built in those occupied territories. In the aftermath of Camp David, a peace will grow between Egypt and Israel that has now lasted more than 30 years. It is not by any means a perfect relationship. Israel has accused Egypt of allowing weapons to pass from its country into the Gaza Strip. But it's certainly been nowhere near as contentious a relationship as it was before the Camp David Accords. Please remember, 48, war, 56, Suez Crisis, 67, Six-Day War. Between 56 and 67, Nasser was arming Fedayeen fighters to go across the border. War of attrition after 67, 73 October War. So there's been nearly constant conflict between Egypt and Israel. Now that's done. The rest of the occupied territories are still unresolved. Gaza, the West Bank, most of the Golan Heights still occupied. And Israel still to this day continues to increase the settlements, the Israeli settlements within those territories. Sadat will be condemned as a traitor by much of the Arab world. And in October of 1981, Anwar Sadat himself will be assassinated by militants within his own military, connected with a group called the Islamic Brotherhood. The Islamic Brotherhood, which has actually been a part of the Arab Spring movement in Egypt and now having important seats within the government of Egypt. In 1981, Anwar Sadat is assassinated. Now, to connect it to today, following Sadat's assassination, a guy named Hosni Mubarak will rise to power in Egypt, and that's the guy that was thrown out a couple years ago when the Arab Spring came to Egypt. The Arab League will boycott Egyptian goods, and Egypt will cease to be a powerful leader in the Arab world. At the same time, guys, that Egypt is going to be taking a step back, we are going to see the rise of Saddam Hussein in prominence in the Middle East, and that will take you to many other chapters of this story that we're not going to be talking about. Following this, we see big changes from the Americans. And we will largely be distracted away from the Arab-Israeli story. There's a revolution in Iran in 1979. that overthrows the pro-American government in Iran and results in American hostages from the U.S. Embassy in Iran being taken hostage. The Soviet Union will invade Afghanistan in 1979. Jimmy Carter will be defeated in his re-election campaign by Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan will immediately send America's focus, foreign policy-wise, where? Right back to the Cold War, right? Soviet Union, evil empire, the coming of the Second Cold War, and we stop having such a strong focus, at least from our president, on the Arab-Israeli story. Now, if Carter had won that election, is there a chance that maybe some Palestinian issue would have been worked on or resolved within those 5 years? Maybe. We don't know. We don't know. But certainly Ronald Reagan was not pushing for any resolution to the Palestinian issue as Carter might have. Questions, comments, concerns?